Hello and welcome back. We are continuing with The Hobbit on Roleplay Riot. We are on part 13. As the Count grew, he slowed down and he began to get shaky and weepy, for he was leaving the water further and further behind, and he was getting afraid. Goblins might be about, and he had lost his ring. At last he stopped by a low opening on their left as they went up.
7 right, yes. 6 left, yes, he whispered. This is it. This is the way to the back door, yes. Here's the passage.
He peered in and shrank back.
But we dursn't go in, precious. No, we dursn't. Goblinses down there. Lots of goblinses. We smells them. What shall we do? Curse them and crush them. We must wait here, precious. Wait a bit and see.
So they came to a dead stop. Gollum had brought Bilbo all the way out after all, but Bilbo could not get in. There was Gollum, sitting humped upright in the opening, and his eyes gleamed cold in his head, and he swayed it from side to side between his knees. Bilbo crept away from the wall more quietly than a mouse, but Gollum stiffened at once and sniffed, and his eyes went green. He hissed softly but menacingly. He could not see the hobbit, but now he was on the alert, and he had other senses that the darkness had sharpened. Hearing and smell. He seemed to be crouched right down with his flat hands splayed on the floor, and his head thrust out, nose almost to the stone. Though he was only a black shadow in the gleam of his own eyes, Bilbo could see or feel he was tense as a bowstring, gathering for a spring. Bilbo almost stopped breathing. He went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away out of this horrible darkness while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing, put out its eyes, kill it. It meant to kill him? No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him, or tried to yet, and he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden understanding, a pity mixed with horror welled up in Bilbo's heart, a glimpse of endless, unmarked days, without light or hope of betterment, hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All these thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled, and then quite suddenly, in another flash, as if lifted by new strength and resolve, he leaped. No great leap for a man, but a leap in the dark. Straight over Gollum's head he jumped, 7 feet forward and 3 in the air. Indeed, had he known it, he only just missed cracking his skull on the low arch of the passage. Gollum threw himself backwards and grabbed as the hobbit flew over him, but too late. His hands snapped on thin air, and Bilbo, falling fair on his sturdy feet, sped off down the new tunnel. He did not turn to see what Gollum was doing. There was a hissing and a cursing almost at his heels at first. Then it stopped. All at once there came a blood-curdling shriek. Filled with hatred and despair, Gollum was defeated. He dared go no further. He had lost his prey, lost too the only thing he had ever cared for, his precious. The cry brought Bilbo's heart to his mouth, but still he held on. Now faint as an echo, but menacing, the voice came from behind.
Thief! 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 Bad dragons! We hate it! We hate it! We hate it forever!
Then there was silence. And that too seemed menacing to Bilbo. If goblins are so near that he smelt them, he thought, then he'll have heard this shrieking and cursing. Careful now, or this way will lead to worse things. The passage was low and roughly made, and it was not too difficult for the hobbit, except when, in spite of all care, he stubbed his poor toes again, several times, on nasty, jagged stones on the floor. A bit low for goblins, at least the big ones, thought Bilbo, not knowing that even the big ones, the orcs of the mountains, go at great speed, stooping low, with their hands almost on the ground. Soon the passage that had been sloping down began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply. That slowed Bilbo down. But at last the hope stopped. The passage turned a corner and dipped down again, and there, at the bottom of a short incline, he saw, filtering round another corner, a glimpse of light. Not red light, as of a fire or lantern, but a pale, out-of-doors sort of light. Then Bilbo began to run. Scuttling as far as his legs would carry him, he turned the last corner and came suddenly right into an open space, where the light, after all that time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright. Really, it was only a leak of sunshine through the doorway, where a great door, a stone door, was left standing open. Bilbo blinked, and suddenly he saw goblins. Goblins in full armor, with drawn swords, sitting just inside the door and watching with wide eyes, watching the passage that led to it. They were aroused, alert, ready for anything. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him. Whether it was an accident or a last trick of the ring before it took a new master, it was not on his finger. With yells of delight, the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like the echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo, and forgetting even to draw his sword, he struck his hands into his pockets, and there was the ring still in his left pocket. And it slipped on his finger. The goblins stopped short. They could not see a sign of him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud as before, but not so delightedly. "Where is it?" they cried. "Go back up the passage," some shouted. "This way," some yelled. "This way," others yelled. "Look out the door," bellowed the captain. Whistles blew, armors clashed, swords rattled. Goblins cursed and swore and ran hither and thither, falling over one another and getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry, to-do, and disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but he had a sense to understand what was happening and to sneak behind a big barrel which held drink for the goblin guards, so to get out of the way and avoid being bumped into, trampled to death, or caught by feel. "I must get to the door, I must get to the door," he kept saying to himself. But it was a long time before he ventured to try. It was like a horrible game of blind man's bluff. The place was full of goblins running about, and the poor little hobbit dodged this way and that, and was knocked over by a goblin who could not make out what he had bumped into, scrambled away on all fours, slipped between the legs of the captain just in time, got up, and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed it nearly to. Bilbo struggled as he could not move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed and squeezed, and he stuck. It was awful. His buttons had gotten wedged on the edge of the door in the doorpost. He could see outside into the open air. There were a few steps running down the narrow valley between tall mountains. The sun came out from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door, but he could not get through. Suddenly, one of the goblins inside shouted, "There's a shadow by the door. Something is outside." Bilbo's heart jumped into his mouth. Then he gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through, with a torn coat and a waistcoat leaping down the steps like a goat, with bewildered goblins still picking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course, they soon came down after him, hooting and hollering and hunting among the trees. But they don't like the sun. It makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy. They could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of the shadow of the trees, running quick and quiet, keeping out of the sun. Soon they went back grumbling and cursing to guard the door. Bilbo had escaped. Chapter 6. Out of the frying pan, into the fire. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, ponies, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on and on till the sun began to sink westward. Behind the mountains, their shadows fell across Bilbo's path as he looked back. Then he looked forward. He could see before him only ridges and slopes falling towards lowlands, and plains glimpsed occasionally between the trees. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "I seem to have gotten right to the other side of the misty mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where, oh where can Gandalf and the dwarves have got to? I only hope to goodness they are not still back there in the power of the goblins." He still wandered on, out of the little high valley, over its edge, and down the slopes beyond. But all the while, very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether he ought not, now that he had the magic ring, to go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back, and very miserable he felt about it, when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. He did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path, winding downwards with a rocky wall on the left side. On the other side, the ground sloped away, and there were dells below the level of the path, overhung with bushes and low trees. In one of these dells, under the bushes, people were talking. He crept still nearer, and suddenly he saw peering between two big boulders a head with a red hood on it. It was Balin doing lookout. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He had still got the ring on, for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, and he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. "I will give them all a surprise," he thought, as he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could not possibly go on their journey without leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of the goblins, without trying to find if he was alive or dead, or without trying to rescue him. "After all, he is my friend," said the wizard, "and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. Wish to goodness you had not lost him." The dwarves wanted to know why he'd even been brought at all, why he could not stick with his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. "He's got to be more trouble than use so far," said one. "If we've got to go back now into those abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say." Gandalf answered angrily, "I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you will help me to look for him, or I go and leave you out here in this mess as best you can for yourselves. If we only find him again, you will thank me before this is over. Whatever did you want to drop him for, Dory?" "You would have dropped him too," said Dory, "if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripped up your feet, and kicked you in the back." "Then why didn't you pick him up again?"
Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped my head off with Glamdring, and Thorin was stabbing here and there and everywhere with Orcrist. All of a sudden you gave one of your blinding flashes and we saw goblins running and yelping, and you shouted, "Follow me, everybody!" And everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, as you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards, out the lower door, and helter-skelter down here. And here we are, without a burglar, confusticate him.
And here's the burglar, said Bilbo. And if you want to find out what happens to them after escaping the mountains, we'll cover that in the next part. Thank you so much for watching Role Play Riot.